most of you remember that picture, yeah? BBC News, it's gone global. Bali sea diver taking a picture of him being surrounded by plastic in oceans. Yeah? Most people around the room know that, and I would ask people not to put their hand up if they have seen it, but if they have not seen it. You see, there's one or two. Yeah? So there's not a lot of people there. What this picture has done is has a massive impact. There's one picture that's gone global. That one picture has influenced not only people, and as a resultant, with the whole thing around David Attenborough coming on the back of that as well, and he was already talking about that quite a lot in there. But as a resultant, we see a massive change in how people perceive plastics, how people perceive pollution, and interestingly enough, as a result, we see that quite a few companies, including, I just walked up yesterday from the train station up to here, McDonald's is phasing out their straws from plastic to paper. We see people being really interested in changing plastics, the use of plastics. So there's been a drive up by a very different route than we're traditionally used to, from an image out there, people making that part of their own, and then changing that behavior, not only through our standard ways of evidence, and we get a policy, we go to government, we change things, and that changes what's happening in society, but there's a people-driven basis for that. That changed it not only directly through people and to government, but people, business, and action. And I think we need to think about our evidence as well, on how that changes not only governments and policy, but also changes businesses. And I think this is a very powerful picture that actually did that. Most people know it. The other one is, in terms of evidence and where we're going, I had to put this in. To be able to travel from Scotland to England across the border, I have to talk about SEPA and One Planet Prosperity, as we call this. And this is our chief executive talking about, and he's got a very simple model. He's got a very simple model that he says, and we've picked it up more and more, the moment we're using as a society resources worth of about 3 planets. We've only got 1 planet to live on. So 3 planets we're using resources, going back to 1 planet that we've got the resources for. He's using that in boardrooms. He's using that with DuPont in boardrooms. He's using that big institutional financial organizations. As a result of that, we see that businesses are starting to change their behavior. We see that businesses are putting more and more the environment higher up on the agenda. It's the language they understand. So it's a very high-level picture. Is that completely underpinned by very factual evidence on the ground? I see somebody clearly smiling here on the ground, on the front row, and you're absolutely right. It's very difficult to get that evidence specifically on the ground, and that actually says, is it 2.946 planets? Is it 3.01 planets? Doesn't matter, does it? This is driving decisions by people you want to make decisions, and not only at government level, not only at individual level, but at business level. So sometimes simple concepts and simple high-level concepts really change where we want to go. Right, so evidence. So there's a whole series of different evidences. And what I'm trying to talk about as well here, I come from an EPA, an Environment Protection Agency, as Doug said as well. So what are we using our evidence for? There's 3 or 4 different big categories. So flood warning. Yeah, so the evidence that we collect, that we're talking about this morning, the river levels and such like things, what are we using it for? Flood warning, but it's not only that there's a flood happening, and knowing that that's a flood happening, but enable people and businesses to make decisions either to move out of harm's way, or to move their properties out of harm's way, or do something about it, or as an organization, as a society, to respond to it. And we see barriers being put up, we see people moving things out of harm's way, and we see now as well an interesting debate starting to happen about, are we having the houses on the right spots? Yeah, so it's not only influencing direct action, but it's also influencing that wider debate. So, evidence for example, flood warning. The second bit as an Environment Protection Agency, obviously regulation. So we're using that evidence to understand how do we regulate environmental pressures. Yeah, what is happening, the state of the environment, do we understand the processes, do we understand how we're moving around? But that evidence is wider, and we're starting to look at much wider evidence than traditionally environmental evidence. SEPA is pushing hard along sector plans, whereby we want to understand the whole life cycle, the whole understanding of the whole process that happens in a certain sector, and where the pinch points of pressure are and where the pinch points of powers are. I'm reading on crops, as I said this morning. There are only 12 companies that sell all the agriculture produce in Scotland. So if we want to change anything within there, we've got a very clear concentration of power. So if we can make headway within there, we really can change what's happening in the fields and then therefore what's happening in the environment. So it's wider evidence than we've traditionally been looking at. Lastly, we've been talking about people and informed choices. Yeah? How do people vote with their feet? How does the evidence that we are collecting help people to vote with their feet? There's very clear evidence now starting to build that people are interested about their carbon footprint. Yeah, people are interested about plastics. People want to make the right decisions in their own life. Is the evidence that we're gathering helping people to make those decisions? Because that route, they start changing their buying behavior, and through changing of the buying behavior, we get a really direct impact on the environmental parameters that we talk about. So for me, evidence is much wider than the traditional evidence that we've been looking at. Evidence has got a purpose, and by thinking about that purpose at the beginning, we should really start understanding how we move forward. Right, it's got to be bringing it down to citizen science, because that's one of the other things I lead for in SEPA, so let's go and do that. So traditional evidence for an EPA, an Environment Protection Agency, what's that sitting around? And for me, the key words around that are understanding the processes and the impacts, for example, of pollution, the setting of standards, so what's the maximum that you can put in an environment before you go on unacceptable harm and an unacceptable problem, but also our business keeping to their end of the bargain. Do we know that? And the environmental monitoring, for example, in the fresh water is doing part of that, as we said this morning. It's actually sewage treatment works, discharging in the environment, is that the right number? Are they putting too much in there? And are they crossing compliance with their permits and therefore creating an unacceptable impact to the environment? Evidence that we're looking at. So what can citizen science do in there? This morning we've been looking at some of the things in there. My key things around there are the citizen science has got a huge scope about the spatial and time distribution of evidence. Traditionally, as an EPA, as anything at this moment in time, we're constrained by budgets, but we've got a huge amount of people out there that can gather an awful lot of information. If you take, for example, the Curious Noses, that's a Belgian project, they pushed out in Antwerp 3 summers ago, 2,000 diffusion tubes measuring NOx in Antwerp itself. Interestingly enough, there's a huge publication campaign around that. What that showed on the bottom end, the top right bit of the picture that you hardly can see, is that the monitoring network of the state and of the council only had 4 or 5 locations, high quality. They used modeling to ascertain where to change things. With this, they showed that there is a canyoning effect, and there are clear streets and even crossings where there is the worst air quality. As a resultant, the council and the state are now changing their monitoring and the management of the air quality and how they deal with air quality in that city. But as a resultant as well, because people did that, they're now changing their behavior. So you see in Belgium that schools have been blocked by parents for all the parents to come in there with their car to drop kids off, because the worst air quality is at the playground during the pick-off time. So you see a clear behavior change by people as a resultant of measuring. What we also see is that that's driven that up to policy level. So instead of that being low in the policy agenda, that became important at the regional level and now at the national level. So the measuring of air quality by people in the city changed the behavior of the person, but also changed the policy and the politics around that. So there's 2 routes to impact. And I think that's very powerful, where citizen science can do an awful lot. They've pushed that now out at 20,000 units across the whole of Flanders, and that's gone from strength to strength, and it's now really changing the debate. So at the national elections last year in Belgium, that was one of the key things that all parties were talking about. So measuring by a local, by a person, changed the behavior of the person, changed politics, and changed our understanding as an EPA of what to do right in the environment. And so we help that to quality assure the air quality models. This morning we already been talking about and hearing about how citizen science do an awful lot on the biological side. I will be talking about here about the quality assurance. So for example, citizen science you can use not to drive the model itself that predicts what air quality there is, but to quality assure whether or not the outputs of that model are in the right ballpark. The Dutch have done that, the Belgians have done that. It's very interesting. It's called Luftdaten. So there is a citizen science application about air quality called Luftdaten that's been spreading obviously from Germany across the whole of the continent. Well, that's got this particular matter and very easy sensors. That's now been this very well distributed data in time and space about air quality in terms of particulate matter. So that's stuff that we normally don't get from our monitoring stations in that kind of distribution. So there's real power in there. For us as an EPA, it's really interesting because the citizen scientists are ears and the eyes and the ears of us on the ground. Yeah? And I'll comment into that in a second again. So, as I said, the citizen science is really good at picking up long-term distributions in space and time. And one of the papers just came out, and I just picked it up the other week from LinkedIn, and that is a paper that we all know there is a biodiversity change, decline. Decline is a dangerous word in here, and that's why I don't call it decline, because I think there's a change. What it showed is that purely based on citizen science evidence, there is a shift of species across the country, especially in aquatic and freshwater habitats and terrestrial. What we see on the back of that is that species that were sensitive to acidification are now coming back. The freshwater species that were really sensitive to eutrophication are returning, but other species are declining. So there is a shift of species rather than a decline, but citizen science data really drove that paper, and that's becoming really influential. SEPA, such as the Environment Agency and others, are using rain gauging, a long-term rain gauging network to understand how rain, and that rain then comes into our freshwater resources and flows, and then it goes around the environment. Yeah, so where are the flows, when are they coming down? We've got the longest records are actually coming from rain gauge observers. And they're really interesting to see what's happening. And kids are picking that up. They start to understanding what's happening in their local environment and what's happening in their world. But we're still sitting in a situation whereby the public is not trusting us anymore. Yeah, I think we need to be really honest about that. That if you look at the top of that graph, that is a paper in Nature, whereby especially in the States, the trust in the trust in government and the trust in that the government is looking out there for you and making life as good as possible for you has declined massively from 64 to 2000, around the 2000s. There's a massive reduction in trust. Yeah, a massive reduction is that the state is out there for you. So people are not trusting us as environment agencies, as agencies anymore, that we're doing the right thing for them. So that's really important, that there is discrepancy between what people think is right and what we are doing. If you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer in 2019, the global trust barometer that looks at trust, that trust is moved away from state to the small zone that you can influence yourself. So that is work and that's your friends. Interestingly enough, the things like your network on the internet, your bubble that you're in, you trust them as well. So there has been a shift in trust from away from the government, the state are doing the right thing to you, to it's the bit that I can influence. I think we need to take that into consideration, because in the end of the day we're managing the environment on behalf of the people. Yeah, so we're managing long term on the behalf of the people, but that's what we're doing. And if the people are switching off and don't trust us anymore, we've got an issue here. So bringing that around and thinking about citizen science, One of the big applications we're running at the moment, and what's also being run in England and in other parts of the UK, is around flood warning. So what we're doing in catchment, where we can't have kind of flood and water level gauging anywhere, so we're using citizen science approaches to measure water height and water level in upstream catchments where we've got very low distribution of and we haven't got any gauging. What that does is a simple thing under a bridge that pings down a beam. That beam comes basically back, and I can go into the detail if you want to. Beam comes back up again and starts sending a trigger alert over a phone network, a mobile phone network in a local community when it comes above a certain trigger. Especially in the flashy upland catchment in Scotland, that gives the people living in that catchment a warning of about 2 to 3 hours whether or not a flood peak is coming. So it's not the long-term flood peaks we've got here in England, it's short, it's spatey. As a result, people can put sandbags in front of their houses, in front of their shops, to prevent that water coming in. They move animals out of harm's way. So a citizen science approach in terms of water level monitoring embedded within the community is now really driving the flood behavior and the response of a local community. So we are empowering, by giving them the right tools, we're empowering them to take action in their own life. That's rebuilding trust. Because now suddenly those people, and there's very clear evidence, they're starting to understand what we're doing and seeing why we're doing it. So they're starting to build a level of trusting back to us again as an EPA. There should have been an outline of Scotland around that, and I don't know why that's gone, so I can quickly draw that around you on the dots on the graph there. Fly tipping. Who would have thought of fly tipping as citizen science? Well, what fly tipping for us does, it creates a spatial and a temporal picture of waste streams in the environment. So if I think about it from that perspective, as an environment agency that manages waste, I know where the waste is, where it's illegally being disposed of, and when it is there. But I also know the responsive and the impact of any action that we take to change that behavior. So we've got, and the same in England and in Ireland, we've got like a dumper or a waste reporting thing. As a result, and if somebody phones in that waste is being picked up in 24 or 48 hours being removed. So there's a reward of being good for the environment, and people are worried about it. That's why they report it in. As a resultant, that changes. So people see that we do something about it. We start building trust. The interesting thing for us as well is that we've then suddenly gotten an angle into a community and a group of people that we can work with. Interesting for SEPA and for an environment agency, we know that, for example, the color grading on these numbers, on these things, means whether or not that is 2 tires, which means somebody changing that on Saturday on their own car and chucking them over out of the car window or out of the boot when nobody sees. That is a small van, the back of a van load, which is a small garage that needs to get rid of it, or that is a lorry load full, which is organised crime. So we know by looking at the spatial distribution and about the time distribution over an 8 or 10 or 15 year period, we know when it is happening and we know why that is happening. And for example, if you don't do that on tires, but do that on waste metal, we saw that the price of the scrap metal, the economic price of the scrap metal, was much more important in driving the scrap metal distribution in the landscape and reducing it than any action that we as Environment Agency were putting on that. So interestingly enough, we see that other drivers and other actions are more important, but we also can evaluate are we doing the right thing. The tires is really interesting for us because as a result of we know, for example, if these are lorry loads full, this is illegal and probably associated with waste crime, so we can hit that. We know where they are and we know when they are done, so we can tie that in with focused investigations and hit that. If it is people, we go in there with an advertising campaign. If it is small garages, we can tackle a garage. So instead of just being very distributed, we can be targeted in our effort. So it makes our work as an environment agency easier and better. Lastly, the thing I want to talk about is air and air quality as an example of citizen science outside the birds and the bees observation. That's really important. Across Europe, and I'm not sure if I can still say that at this moment in time here in this audience, probably I can, yeah, we can. And the Scottish government is very supportive of this, so I can. Across Europe, I'm chairing a group on citizen science for the head of the European Environment Agencies. So we're bringing together all that knowledge on how can we use that to do the right thing. Within there, we brought a whole group of citizen scientists and EPAs together to work on air quality. What we saw within there, we focused that on schools and understanding if you measure things in schools around air quality, what's happening with that? And where does that data go? How does that influence people? How does that influence environment agencies or health boards, but also how does that influence people in making their own decisions? So these are two of the banners that kids have done in Renfrewshire and in the school of St. Clair's. So by providing the schools with monitoring equipment on air quality, it became important for the individual in that school. As a resultant, it became important for that individual's parents. As a resultant, we see that the drop-off behavior and the transport of kids to school is starting to change. So we see real action and real impact of data that we gather. But what is very important in there, that we make the people part of their journey and we don't tell them what's going on. This needs to be bottom up. Yeah, and then it becomes really powerful. So you start to empower people to take action, and you start building trust at that same time, because people understand where the data comes from and how that's being used. So examples of citizen science and how you can use that. So as a UKEOF community, bringing that all back down again, I have to do this because Michael is in here and Rob as well, the people that we work with in the UKEOF community. We've got a working group on citizen science, which has been quite active. We've done quite a lot in terms of where are we at this moment in time and starting to look forward. So that's a plug for that group. It's really good. Let's keep that because we can share knowledge. But what we've seen in there and what I hope to show is that citizen science can be really useful. It's complementary evidence. It doesn't replace, it sometimes does, but it doesn't always replace stuff that we measure ourselves. It provides a different lens, a different picture on that we can use to work on that. Some really big decisions, for example, about the biodiversity and about what the response is of biological agents to all the stuff that we do in terms of plants and animals and bees. It's all an awful lot of data around citizen science is really important on that. But there's also a huge potential to empower and restore trust. And if we go back to these trust curves, that if we want to influence people's behavior, we need to empower them and we need to build trust. And if we can do that with a tool that measures things as well, which are good for us, then it's a win-win situation. Last question I want to pose. Do we have the right expertise? No. I'm very honest about that. And I think that's becoming clearer and clearer that as a working group and as environment agencies, we're very good at monitoring, we're very good at measuring, and we're very good at writing reports, but we're not very good at engaging with the public. So there's an awful lot of really good NGOs around there, and one of it's got a poster out there, and I was going to do a special plug around for Earthwatch. So there is global, but also local groups out there that do an awful lot around monitoring in the environment. They've got a much better handle on how to engage with people, and also we're not always trusted from the word go with people out there because they see us as the police. And maybe they don't trust us, so why don't we use vehicles that already got the right influence and the right linkage in there? So just a plug for making sure that we use a community and experience expertise wider than we have ourselves. So just not going to leave that there. There's a whole series of products around citizen science, and I just think it's a very useful and a very powerful way of not only gathering data, but also empowering real action on the ground. Thank you.